Hello there. How are you doing? I do hope you're doing well. I'm doing fine, thank you very much. Welcome to the Saroy channel, and I'm so glad you've joined me for part 3 of our story tonight. And what an exciting story it is. We've got to a very, very exciting part where Gemma is taking a walk in the woodgrove, and she's got that rather disquieting feeling that something or someone is watching her. So before we continue, don't forget to subscribe to the channel, click the notification bell and the thumbs up, and let's continue with part 3 of our story. All of a sudden, Gemma sensed that something was watching her. She was sure it was a formidable presence of some kind. She was well acquainted with this foreboding feeling when taking public transport in San Francisco, when some weirdo was rudely giving her the once-over. She knew unequivocally someone was there, but felt rather foolish when she glanced around her immediate environment and couldn't see anything at all. She was really enjoying living here at Dreamy Heights in such a beautiful little cottage, but she was so used to living in a heavily populated area thronging with bustling activity, and as a consequence of living among so many people from all walks of life, it meant being watched for her by a stranger was not something that was entirely new to her. Surely the meddlesome Mrs. Warmonger wouldn't be following her around in the woods, she wondered. But Gemma had to admit to herself that although Mrs. Warmonger was peculiar, and people did strange things when they were peculiar, she'd witnessed this enough in San Francisco, where being peculiar was sometimes considered rather hip. No, she thought conclusively to herself, Mrs. Warmonger is far too dignified to stoop this low and to follow me around the place. But why was the feeling of being watched really beginning to increase? And it seemed to cling to her, like a tick on a dog's coat, that she simply could not shake off. What's wrong with me? She thought. Why am I engaging in such irrational thoughts? No one is here. What on earth am I like? Gemma finally reached a fork in the footpath that divided into 3 separate paths. The question was, which footpath should she take, as making a decision wasn't always terribly easy for her. She had been told once that this was because she was a Libra. One path went straight ahead, one to the right, and the other to the left. The footpaths were marked with vague, rather obscure signs, but the rust from the caustic coastal sea air had wiped the trail names away, so she couldn't read them at all. In the end, she decided to take the more ambiguous, nameless footpath to her left. It looked more ruggedly wild, more curiously intriguing, and besides all that, it was far closer to the coast, so she hoped that this path would lead her to a tiny little beach hidden between the craggy bluffs and rocky overhangs so typically seen in these more barren, virginal parts of the coast. It would seem taking that turning had not been the best idea after all, as the disloyal trail did not suffer fools gladly, and had become decidedly rocky, and began to look ominously as if it wasn't a trail at all. Gemma's adventurous, perfidious journey through the trees became infinitely more sinister, and the pretty bird-song she had enjoyed earlier on had all but mysteriously dissipated, as if the birds themselves simply refused to sing in this part of the grove, for good reason it would seem. A cold, airy, inauspicious chill seemed to run down Gemma's spine, as she surveyed her bodeful surroundings, that seemed to have become inhospitably malignant and balefully menacing. The ancient ungroomed trees were unashamedly barren and naked, devoid of any modest spring foliage. They were gathered together in a misaligned cluster of trees rather resembling a symposium of very grumpy old men, with gnarled bones and decrepit postures that seemed to be peering down on Gemma from a vast height, like looking at an ant through a pair of binoculars. This confrontational feeling made Emma feel suddenly very conspicuous, almost as if someone had placed her in a jam jar like an insect and was shaking her vigorously around, while studying her with a shameless curiosity that exercised little to no discretion. The combative atmosphere around her was electrically charged with a formidable, almost warlike tension, and Gemma felt like a nervous white-tailed deer that was twitching anxiously, as if it could almost sense the contentious danger was in its midst. Was it danger she was feeling? Gemma wondered. One thing was for sure, that something was decidedly off. And the vibe the trees were giving off was not welcome by any manner of means. Gemma seemed to be inwardly nudged, as if something was instinctively warning her to leave the woodgrove at once. A pertinacious female voice in her head that was not her own seemed to be urging her to go away. "Leave! It's not safe! It's not safe! Grimala is dangerous! He'll hurt you! Grimala will hurt you! You must go! You must leave at once! Grimala will hurt you! Grimala is unpredictable! He's volatile! You need to go! Leave at once!" What the hell, thought Gemma. Where did that voice come from? And who the hell was Grimala? I really am losing my mind and allowing my imagination to run away with me. I hope to God that this is not a nasty side effect of the new medication that Dr. Sternberg prescribed for me. I'm hearing voices in my head that are not my own. This was worrying indeed for her, because Gemma couldn't just pop over to his office in the morning to change her medication, could she? Dr. Sternberg never warned her that the medication she was on might cause her to hear voices. Gemma heard the urgent voice again. Where did it come from? Surely this could not be her medication, playing games with her mind and turning her into a deranged lunatic. "Grimala can be dangerous! I told you, he can be dangerous! You're trespassing on his turf! He's not going to be happy about this! You need to leave at once! He could hurt you! He doesn't like your kind! You're in grave danger! Did you hear me? You're in grave danger!" Gemma was now convinced she was hearing voices. Dr. Sternberg's medication, which he had impassionately assured her was perfectly safe, was obviously anything but. If she was taking medication with side effects like this, she could end up going to a funny farm, being diagnosed with schizophrenia. The thought was too dreadful for words. She felt annoyed with her psychologist, who had insisted she changed her meds, as the side effect of her previous medication had left her feeling restlessly twitchy. But that was nothing on hearing voices in your head like this. It really scared her half to death to feel that something was talking to her, and she was probably making this entity up in her head, because she was becoming delusional. Yet even if her meds were giving her incongruously rather bizarre side effects, Gemma could not deny that something was exceedingly disquieting about the unnatural, rather unorthodox silence in this part of the woods, where she was alone among the ancient trees, some that were easily 300 years old, she had been told, and looking at them she could easily believe it, as if she could tap into their ancient wisdom. A slight wind wantonly wailed through the grove, and some of the lofty, decrepit-looking trees swaggered and swung their emaciated, gnarled arms like inebriated drunks. It was almost as if the time-worn trees themselves were urging Gemma to leave and telling her to go away. What on earth did they know that she didn't? Why did she keep hearing warning sirens going off in her head all the time? Was this her intuition, talking rather than the meds? Gemma could not be sure. It is really horrible in here, Gemma thought. So creepy. There's such a dark, gloomy energy around me that's almost iniquitous. It's as if I'm not wanted here. As if to confirm that her throbbing discomfort was not unfounded, Gemma discovered under a very ugly old tree, with distended branches that rather reminded her of a giant octopus's tentacles, an inexplicable huge collection of animal bones had been put together in such a methodical, concise order, where the animal skulls were gathered together in one bundle, the leg bones in another, and so forth, similar to someone on an archaeological dig, when the archaeologists line up the skeletons in some kind of choreographed, exacting order. Someone intelligent had clearly done this. But why? That was the $101 question Gemma had to ask herself. Who would take a walk in the grove, collect all manner of animal bones, and arrange them in a very precise, neat order like this? It was weird, to say the very least. But then again, Gemma was well used to weird. She had seen it all before, people behaving incredibly strangely. And that was not unusual to her. She had seen some people that walked around looking rather like spaced-out zombies, probably because they were high on some kind of hallucinogenic drug. On one occasion in San Francisco, Gemma had been chased around by an extremely well-dressed man with a baton in his hands, who had been screaming blue murder after her, like a banshee. She had been absolutely petrified of the man, as he was high as a kite. "My wife is cheating on me!" he cried out, waving the baton furiously at Gemma. "I'm going to kill her with this baton! I'm going to kill her! I'm going to kill her!" The deranged man told everyone who would listen that Gemma was his wife, who had cheated on him, and she needed to be dealt with. People assumed Gemma was engaged in some kind of domestic dispute with this man, but Gemma had never seen him a day in her life. But she guessed at once that his idiosyncratic, unorthodox behaviour was because he was mentally unbalanced and very disturbed. "I'm not your wife!" Gemma had cried out. "I don't even know who you are!" The police were well acquainted with the man. They informed Gemma that he would regularly chase after random young women on the streets of San Francisco, telling everyone who would listen that this woman was his wife, who had cheated on him and needed to be dealt with. He'd wave the baton around and thump the sidewalk so furiously hard, as if he was beating up a woman. Gemma had run away so fast while he continued to pursue her, until in absolute exhaustion he had slumped to the ground and dropped his baton in defeat and begun to howl like a baby, because his evil, treacherous wife had managed to escape, and it just wasn't fair. The man was clearly off his trolley, but there he was living on the streets of San Francisco, in a flimsy tent, with no one doing anything to help him to get the medication and psychological help he so clearly needed. Gemma had felt very threatened by the man, and really believed if he got mad enough, he could really do some serious harm to someone. No one arrested him or considered him a danger to society, so he was running around willy-nilly like a walking dead man. The threat that Gemma had felt, being pursued by that zombified man, seemed to have come back to haunt her today. Those unsettling feelings had arrived back again in her life like a long-forgotten parcel in the post that she was reluctant to receive. She had thought on this isolated stretch of coastline she would be perfectly safe. She really didn't need this. She was enjoying herself on the Oregon coast, and now the inauspicious feeling of being watched was making its presence known to her. She persuaded herself she was being absolutely ridiculous. "Feel the fear," she told herself, "and do it anyway." That was something her father had told her on countless occasions, to encourage Gemma to be both bold and courageous at all times, and not to allow herself to be intimidated by the things that crossed her path. Her father would look at her through his very gentle but wise grey eyes as he took a puff of his cigar. "Challenges are meant to be embraced, Gemma dear. People fear many things in this life," he would say, "but what they fail to fully appreciate is that the disabling effects of fear can cripple and incapacitate you. They can hold you back from accomplishing your goals. But when you face your fears, Gemma dear, you can overcome absolutely anything. And nothing, absolutely nothing will be impossible for you. We all have much power, Gemma dear, more power than we can ever imagine. And if we tap into that power, we can quite literally move mountains. Even Jesus said as much in his word. Don't you ever forget that, Gemma." As if hearing her father cheering her on, Gemma became resolutely determined to proceed with her walk through the woods. Her father's salient words cheered her on her merry way, like a crowd in the podium urging the runners to get to the finish line and not to concede defeat, as victory was around the very next corner. Gemma was not going to allow an inconvenient, aggressive fear to sabotage her pleasure. She was going to enjoy this moment and the walk through the woods, and hopefully find a private little beach on this stretch of coastline, somewhere among the trees. "I'm not going to allow this bodefully oppressive part of the woods to intimidate me. I'm going to face my fear and do it anyway, like Dad would expect me to do," she told herself with a stern conviction. "I'm sorry, but I'm not going to run out of the woods like a frightened rabbit. I'm better than that." Even though Gemma's father had sadly died of pancreatic cancer years ago, She could almost see him standing in the woodgrove, giving her the thumbs up, urging her to overcome her fears. She could almost hear him saying, in his deep voice, "You can do it, Gemma. I know you can." "You're right, Dad," she whispered under her breath. "I can do this, and I will do it." Gemma soon found herself journeying down a rather bizarre-looking pathway, where some hideously decrepit trees were wearing what looked to be handmade creepy decorations that had been deliberately twisted and shaped into grotesque, menacing symbols that had to have some kind of cryptic message behind them, like a Morse code of some kind, perhaps. What could they possibly mean, Gemma had wondered, and who would do something like this? The symbols gave off a hateful, vindictive vibe, as if they were telling Gemma to get out. It was when she observed a bright beam of light stealing its way through the barren branches of a few semi-naked trees that fringed the coastline. She caught a faint glimpse of golden beach sand, turquoise ocean, blue sky, hemmed in by some very sculptural-looking cliff faces, and she could hear the loud cries of seagulls soaring into the sky. The sneaky preview that Gemma got through the branches of the tree was breathtakingly beautiful, so much so that Gemma almost held her breath. This was what she had been looking for, a tiny beach hidden between the cliffs like a priceless golden gem, which could become her own quintessential secret place to visit. She could bring Molly here, she thought, and do some oil painting on canvas. She could paint the rugged contours of the rocks and the gorgeous ocean, and its truculent waves beating against the rocks with a plethora of white, bubbly sea foam. She could not observe the view very clearly. It was unfortunately blocked out by a curtain of thick, rambling foliage, so she eagerly pulled it back to see the view more clearly. Then she saw him. At first Gemma thought her eyes had to be deceiving her, but as she peered at the creature more intently, she was in no doubt of what she was observing. It was a huge Bigfoot. He was squatting on a large rock. The ocean waves splashed against the rock in a thunderous roar, their white lacy foam covering him with a fine spray. But the Bigfoot didn't seem to mind being covered with water. Gemma assumed the Bigfoot was staring out at the ocean, almost in a meditational but transfixed state. As if lost in thought, it would certainly be easy to get carried away, with views as prepossessing and idyllic as this, she thought. The Bigfoot barely moved. He remained motionless, except to scratch the back of his pyramid-shaped head with his fingers that were as large as pork sausages. Gemma knew instinctively that she was observing a male Bigfoot. He was incredibly intimidating to look at, as his sheer size was overpowering, rather reminding Gemma of King Kong. The creature's back was covered with long flowing dark hair, the colour of black coal. Gemma was so curious that her intrigue immediately confiscated any concerns for her own safety. I mean, it wasn't every day you got a bird's-eye view of a Bigfoot, did you? And Gemma wanted to observe the creature for a little longer. Gemma could tell by the Bigfoot's powerful, imposing gait that he was remarkably human, even though his back was facing away from her. Gemma stood very still, staring at the Bigfoot in wondrous awe, hardly daring to believe what she was actually seeing, and wishing with all her heart that she had a pair of binoculars on hand. "Is this thing even real?" she kept asking herself again and again. "Or is this a hallucinatory side effect of my medication? Please God, may the latter not be the case." She told herself that the Bigfoot was not made up by her mind. This was real. She knew it was. In a trice the male Bigfoot bounced up to his feet, and Gemma realized he was probably about 9 foot tall. He began to turn around to look in the direction where Gemma was concealing herself discreetly behind the curtain of foliage. Surely he wouldn't be able to observe her. Please God, no. This is the last thing she wanted. The Bigfoot's powerful intuition had alerted him to the fact that someone was indeed watching him. It was when the Bigfoot let out a loud, indignant roar and began to furiously thump his chest with his fists. Gemma could feel that she'd wet her leggings. The urine dribbled down her legs, but that was the least of her concerns right now. Oh my goodness, the Bigfoot knew she was there. He was extremely ticked off. He appeared to be blowing quite a gasket as he punched the air so angrily. Was he going to come after her? Please God, no! She could sense the Bigfoot was becoming irate, like an infuriated bear that had been unfortunately poked with a stick and had been provoked to anger. She couldn't run away, much as she wanted to. She was pinned to the spot, her whole body trembling like a blancmange jelly, while her heart thundered so loudly in her chest she thought she was going to have a heart attack, as the noise of her heart was louder than the ocean waves. She was so crippled by a paralyzing fear that she simply couldn't shake off, try as she might. If Gemma thought that wacko man in San Francisco imposed a threat, that was nothing on what she felt right now. She knew she could escape that man because he was so ungainly and couldn't particularly run very fast. But could she escape a monstrous Bigfoot who had sensed she was spying on him and had obviously taken great offence by this? A big stone came flying aimlessly through the shrubbery, nearly hitting Gemma square in the face. Before Gemma could think about what she should do in these paradoxical circumstances, she was thrown onto this lofty pair of shoulders and was travelling through the woods at record speed. She knew it was a Bigfoot that had abducted her, but not the one she'd seen on the beach. This Bigfoot was infinitely smaller than the one on the beach. Gemma wanted to scream, she wanted to call out for help, but she knew it would be useless, for no one would hear her out here. What was this Bigfoot going to do with her? Was she going to end up being one of those 411 cases when people mysteriously vanished off the face of the earth, never to be seen again? Is this what happened to some missing people? Were they actually abducted by Bigfoot, she wondered. She tried to cry out, she really did, but her throat was constricted and had dried up like an old riverbed in a bad drought, and the only thing that came out of her mouth was a pitiful bleat that made her sound like a billy goat. Then she heard the soothing but comforting voice in her head. "I'm not going to hurt you. You wouldn't listen to me when I told you to get away from Grimala. He's not right in the head, you know. If he sees you, he will kill you. He doesn't like anyone going near his patch of turf. That little beach is his. He knows you were spying on him. That made him very angry. I'm just going to get you to safety, because of Grimala. If he loses it, you won't see another day." Gemma began to visibly relax. She took in some deep breaths. The Bigfoot had rescued her. It was female. It was trying to help her. It had no intentions of harming her. Thankfully, the voice that she had heard was not from her medication after all, but from a Bigfoot that had been communicating to her telepathically in the grove, while at the same time wanting to remain elusive and detached. No wonder, she thought, someone had been stalking her in the grove. It had been the female Bigfoot who had tried to get her to leave the place, but Gemma had failed to listen to the warning signs. Grimala was obviously a dangerous Bigfoot, who had posted keep-out signs capriciously over his little patch of the woodgrove in the form of those twisted baubles that she had seen hanging on the trees. He was obviously marking his territory. All of a sudden Gemma could hear loud, heavy thrashes of branches being intermittently broken, the booming sounds of ponderous feet hitting the forest floor, followed by roars that were so loud that it almost caused the entire woodgrove to vibrate from the terrifying echo. It was then that Gemma realized that Grimala was hot on their trail. He was getting closer and closer. Gemma was filled with terror. This was not going to end well, she thought. Her life seemed to flash before her. "I don't want to die," she cried out to God. "Please don't let me die. I'm a mother, for goodness sake. I've got a baby that really needs me." The female Bigfoot increased her pace and quickly placed Gemma in a tree branch that, by some fortunate twist of fate, seemed to have remembered that spring was on its way, as the branch was covered in an abundance of big leaves that easily concealed her slender frame. "Stay there," the voice said in her head. "I need to get Grimala off your scent." Gemma trembled as she snuggled up to the ancient tree branch that was so huge she could comfortably sit on the branch as if it was a swing. She peered through the foliage as a huge, hefty, terrifying, intimidating male Bigfoot came thundering up to the female. He did not look best pleased. It looked as if steam was coming out of his nostrils. This was without doubt Grimala, the male Bigfoot she'd seen on the beach. The expression on his human-like face was absolutely irate, and when he spoke to the female Bigfoot in a strange language, his voice was so formidable It made Gemma shake like a leaf. Gemma had never heard such a booming voice like that in her entire life. If the voice was heard in a conference room, everyone would pay attention at once. Oh my God! Imagine if he sees me in the tree, she thought. What will I do then? The female Bigfoot began pointing towards the path on the right. She was talking to the male Bigfoot in a soothing, matter-of-fact tone of voice. It was like she was trying to calm down the flustered, very aggrieved male. But he was caught up in the cocoon of his outrage. Kikali kwasi, okulopati lanika, olopotoloso, akila talamaki, hofaki sakwa, hilatilobo, ikatika, hopoloso. The male Bigfoot was looking in the direction where the female was pointing. He nodded his head, said something, hakila kinapa, and then took off through the grove like a rhinoceros in the thicket. And then he was gone. Moments later, Gemma found herself being placed back on the female Bigfoot's back. The female Bigfoot began racing through the woods in a tearing rush. Gemma heard the voice in her head again. I told Grimala, that you took the path to the right. Grimala doesn't know that I was hiding you from him. If you come into the grove again, don't go near his patch, or next time you might not be so lucky to escape with your life. Grimala is not aware of his own strength. If he lashed out at you in a moment of anger, you will be done for. When the female Bigfoot put Gemma down, it was at the bottom of the iron steps of the cliff that led directly up to the cottage. Gemma was drawn to the female Bigfoot's eyes that were so compassionately kind. I'm a mother too, she said, speaking to Gemma in her head. But this time her words were audible and spoken to her in a strange language that miraculously translated itself into English in her head. Kolati kasi, otola patilanikwa, sono shakasa. Go back to your baby. I'm sure she needs you. Our babies need us, do they not? Gemma was stunned by this. How could the female Bigfoot possibly know she was a mother? Unless the Bigfoot had actually observed her taking a casual stroll on the beach, with little Molly strapped to her chest. That must be it, she thought privately to herself. Bigfoots probably know everything that's going on around them. They observe everything, they see everything, and yet at the same time remain as inconspicuous as invisible ink on paper. I also have a girl, said the Bigfoot. I'm warning you for your own safety. It's not safe messing around with the likes of Grimala. He's unhinged, I'm afraid. He's not partial to your kind. He's my brother. He's volatile. He's explosive. He's always been capriciously moody. My mother called him Stormy when he was born. He's exactly like a storm. In the same way, when the storm rages, it then finally passes, and the sun comes out again. Grimala is exactly like that. He's not all bad, you know. But when he loses it, even I am frightened of him. In the morning he will have forgotten all about you. He has a memory like a sieve. But right now he's after your blood. When he's mad, the consequences are not always good, said the female Bigfoot, hanging her head sadly. God forbid if you get caught up in the firing line of his wrath. If you avoid going near his patch of turf, he'll leave you well alone. The last thing you ever want is to spy on him. If you spy on him, he'll see that as a threat. I'm sure he's forgotten all about you. Well, he will have done so by the morning. Gemma could not even thank the female Bigfoot, for she quickly gestured for Gemma to go, and then she glided back to the trees and disappeared from Gemma's sight. The Bigfoot had saved her life. Gemma was in no doubt that Grimala would have killed her. He was so powerful. Probably one whack across her face with his indignant hand would have done the job in a single second. Gemma made her way back to Dreamy Height Cottage, with her heart still flapping violently in her chest, after having narrowly escaped Grimala's clutches. She could see the dark silhouette of Mrs. Warmonger twitching the curtains and peering out at her curiously, as that incorrigible woman was incredibly nosy. Did Mrs. Warmonger really not know that Gemma could see her standing there in the window? Did she have nothing better to do than spy on Gemma, she wondered? Was her life so pitifully dull that she obviously got her kicks out of watching Gemma all the time, and no doubt obviously judging her for having a short break away from little Molly, almost as if she was a neglectful mother? Gemma didn't care what the old woman thought. If she'd been younger, she'd have probably stuck her tongue out at the woman, but adults didn't behave like that. When Gemma arrived back at the cottage, she quickly made herself a cup of very sweet tea. She was still feeling rather jittery. If that female Bigfoot had not intervened on her behalf, things could have gone badly pear-shaped. Why did I not listen to the voice that I was hearing? She reprimanded herself. All the ominous signs on the trees were everywhere, telling me to get out and to leave. I should have listened. I should have been more astute. I should have paid attention. Instead, I was listening to my father's salient advice, by facing up to my fears. But that could easily have cost her life. Instinctively, after Gemma had gained her composture, like any mother would do, she quickly hurried off to the nursery, wondering if little Molly had awoken from her nap yet. As she reached the cot, Molly was looking up at her with bright, expectant eyes, and seemed to be chuckling away happily. She appeared content. I'm sure I dressed her in that pink onesie, she thought. But now the pink onesie appeared to be in the laundry basket, and Molly was wearing a yellow onesie. How was that even possible? Surely I'd remember if I'd put her into this yellow onesie, Gemma thought. Even stranger, it looked as if little Molly's diaper had been recently changed. The bedroom smelt strongly of baby powder, which she didn't use very often. What was going on here, Gemma wondered. I would know if I'd changed my baby's diaper. When Gemma returned to the refrigerator to look for the bottle of baby milk she had pumped and stored away for Molly's next feed, it wasn't there. What on earth was going on? Maybe her medication really was the problem after all. How was it that she couldn't remember feeding little Molly with the breast milk that she had pumped and left in the refrigerator? How on earth could she forget all this, she wondered. Am I going doodle alley? I'm not going to tell Bernie about any of this, nor will I tell him about the Bigfoot I encountered in the woods. I will not be telling him that I can't remember changing Molly's diaper, because if I do, he'll really believe I'm losing my marbles. She groaned when she heard a knock at the front door. Out here there could be only one person dropping over to check on her. It was likely Mrs. Warmonger. For some reason the incorrigible woman seemed to think she was entitled to drop around at least once a day to ask Gemma one rather fruitless question. Is everything all right, dear? I thought I would check up on you, is what she would always say. What did the old woman expect her to say? No, it's not, Mrs. Warmonger. Mrs. Warmonger was standing there in the doorway. She was wearing her long black dress and looking as if she'd stepped out of an 1800s photograph. The formidable, rather condescending look on her face was not something that Gemma wanted to greet right now. Everything all right, Mrs. Songbird? She predictably asked. Thank you, Mrs. Warmonger. Everything's absolutely fine. Couldn't be better. Good, I'm glad to hear that, Mrs. Songbird. It's just I couldn't help but notice you went for a walk without your baby on the beach. You left little Molly alone in the cottage. I know it's not my business, but is that a good idea, dear, to leave your baby unattended like that? Anything could happen to the poor little mite. Mrs. Warmonger, Molly's absolutely fine. Sometimes I need a breather, that's all. I put her to sleep in her cot after I fed her. She had a nice nap, and she was sleeping when I went for a walk. It's safe here, isn't it? On the Oregon coast. As far as I can see, there's no one out here who might potentially abduct her. So I know she's fine. Well, you can never be too careful, dear, can you, when it comes to the young uns, Mrs. Songbird said. If you ever need a break, I don't mind looking after little Molly for you. I'm very good with babies, I'll have you know. If things get rather overwhelming for you, I don't mind lending a hand. You shouldn't be too ashamed to ask for help if you need it, dear. It's very kind of you, Mrs. Warmonger, but I assure you I'm managing with Molly perfectly well. Good, I'm very glad to hear it, Mrs. Songbird. Very glad indeed. I hope everything here is satisfactory. You do know if you need anything at all, you only need say the word. Your husband told me to look out for you. I do understand your mental health has been a little compromised of late, and I understand all about it. When women have babies,
They take on a lot of responsibility, you know, and it can be very overwhelming for many. So, as I keep telling you, I don't mind helping out and lending a hand, reducing the load for you. You only have to ask. The last thing you want to do is leave little Molly on her own."
"That's kind of you to offer, Mrs. Warmonger, but I really don't need any help," said Gemma, closing the front door rather abruptly behind her. She was feeling very affronted. No wonder Mrs. Warmonger was spying on her all the time. Bernie had put her up to this and told the woman about her postnatal depression. How dare he confide in her like that? When he came home tonight from work, his life would not be worth living. This woman had been encouraged to watch over her. What was he thinking? She was perfectly capable of looking after herself, and the very last person she wanted watching over little Molly was Mrs. Warmonger of all people. So there we are. That is the end of part 3 of our story. Part 4 is tomorrow night, and I look forward to you joining me then. Until next time, goodbye and good night.